G'day all. I'm looking to see if anyone has had a similar experience or may have an explanation for us. A bit of background information. This is my auntie's encounter from last night, 18th of June 2020, in New South Wales, Australia. It occurred at approximately 9:30 p.m. Earlier that day, she had driven past a motorcycle accident which had resulted in a fatality. My auntie, we'll call her Terry, has always been slightly psychic and has had several encounters with spirits and past family members throughout her life, but has never seen anything like this or experienced the sense of dread that came with it. Last night after work, Terry was driving home along a stretch of road that is surrounded by bushland on either side. Upon driving up over a slight hill, she saw a figure standing on the tree line, illuminated by her headlights. The figure immediately had her full attention, and a total sense of dread came over her entire body. She described it as a constricting bubble. This figure stood approximately 8 feet tall, had elongated limbs, was completely white, had no clothes, no genitals, and no face. The figure was directly facing her and turned to track the car as she drove past. Terry immediately began sobbing and called my mother, stating she had just seen a terrible, horrible thing on the side of the road. She drove down the same road today to find an explanation, but found nothing. It was almost a Slender Man type figure. We have spoken to a few people, and here are some of the explanations so far. One friend suggested that it may have been the victim of the crash earlier in the day, trying to leave Earth, but had become stuck on the way up. Another friend believes that it was some kind of guardian angel, sending her a sign of some kind. It is believed that angels may present themselves in a seriously striking form, as a distraction to save or warn you of something. Maybe she was speeding and it stopped her from having an accident. I'd like to add that my auntie or myself are not religious at all, but all of our family has been baptized and finds comfort in the idea that there are people looking out for us. We would love to hear your thoughts and ideas on what she may have experienced. Cheers.
We don't get the kind of stuff down here that I see a lot of on this sub. A lot of it's Native American folklore I see here, which is creepy as hell, but I feel like our stuff is of a different world altogether. I've seen some stuff. A lot of it, we don't even know what to call. Our First Nation stories aren't as well documented as your Native American stories are, sadly. A lot of it got all but wiped out during the colonial years, and far beyond, come to think of it. But there are bits and pieces. There are voices that keep the old stories alive, and a few of them seem to tie in pretty neatly with what we saw that night. Me and my best mate, Gavin, we grew up together in Home Hill, one of the two townships either side of the mighty Burdekin River. You got Ayr, the bigger of the two towns on one side, and our sleepy little town on the other. We used to camp out a lot when we were growing up, but this was always done simply in our backyards, as we were too young to camp out for real. This all changed when we hit 15 years old. We were finally given the freedom to wander down to the riverside and have little overnight campouts. Now, of course, these excursions came with strict rules, as we lived in croc country. Where we live, it's basically where the Burdekin River meets the ocean, so strictly no swimming. No going near the water's edge, as well as the usual croc-safe stuff. Don't leave food out around your campsite. Set up camp well back from the water, etc. So, here we are, heading out for our first big campout. Oh boy, did we feel like big men. All alone, nothing but our swags, a tent, and a few overnight supplies. Ready to tackle the big wide world. We followed all the rules though. We weren't silly. Growing up here, of course, you hear stories of croc attacks and, believe me, they are not pleasant. And in fact, they stand shoulder to shoulder with any supernatural monster I've read about. Fast forward to nighttime. We're settling into sleep. We're playing silly games, telling each other scary stories, just doing what young fellas do. When in the dead of the night, we pause. We pause because we hear something. A faint sound, but easily identifiable. A faint dragging. This caused us to bolt upright. There's only one thing around here making a sound like that. There's a croc dragging itself up the riverbank towards us. We shut off our torches and we huddled together towards the back of the tent. Gavin started feeling around for his pocket knife. We were planning to cut a hole in the back of the tent and make a run for it. We couldn't go out the front. It would be waiting right there for us. We would be running right into its jaws. The dragging sound continued. Gush, flop, gush, flop. Yeah, no doubt, that's a croc. With trembling hands, we continued fumbling around, looking for the pocket knife to make our escape. But we couldn't find it. That dragging sound was so close now, and we could hear the thing sniffing around. We could hear its guttural noises as it poked around our campsite. This was serious now. We were very much in a life or death situation. We had two options here. We could sit still and just hope that this thing doesn't smell us. Or we could try our luck running out the front tent flap. We tried desperately ripping a hole in the tent with our bare hands, but we just couldn't do it. And the way this tent was built, we couldn't just lift it up and run out the back. We were trapped. Even if we wanted to consider running, honestly, we were frozen in place. I don't think that was ever gonna be an option. I don't know how long we sat frozen like that. I mean, it must have been a matter of less than a minute, but my God, let me tell you, it felt like much longer. Eventually, we heard a different kind of dragging sound, one that went on for much longer and was heading away from our campsite. The croc was dragging itself away. No, the crocodile was being dragged away. We could hear its jaws snapping. We could hear the sound of heavy footfalls. And then we heard the most disgusting sound of flesh tearing, ripping, innards spilling. Oh, it was horrible. Whatever was happening out there, we got the impression that we were now faced with something much worse than a croc. There was something out there, big enough to drag a crocodile and, by the sounds of things, kill it. We continued sitting there, just huddled at the back of that tent. And then there was silence. The animal stopped resisting. and we heard only the sound of a lifeless body falling helplessly to the ground. Then, silence yet again. Silence, until the sound of heavy footsteps once again reverberated through the still night air. I don't know what the hell we were thinking. We could have just sat there. We could hear the footsteps moving away. We should have stayed put. I don't know. Maybe we thought that because whatever this was had killed the croc, that it was somehow friendly. I don't know. We were stupid kids. We were panicked. We were in a state of shock. But, for whatever stupid, pig-headed reason, we slowly unzipped the flap and stuck out our heads. It was massive. I mean, massive. At least 8 foot tall. Probably bigger. Its limbs were not human. Nah, far from it. They were all cracked and broken and, honestly, looked like this whole thing's body was made of stone. It was lumbering away into the river. It was just walking through the water like it wasn't bothered. It dragged something in its hand, something long and sharp. I guess that's what mutilated our crocodile. Yeah, that's what else we saw. There certainly had been a croc, but not no more. This was no small specimen either. This crocodile, it must have been at least a 4-meter salty. Its lifeless body lay by the river's edge, a massive cut down its gut. There is nothing out here capable of doing that. Or so we thought. We watched in awe as this thing continued to wander off into the night. As it walked, it released these inhuman sounds. Grunts, grumbles. Those sounds still haunt me today. I have no doubt this thing was not a friend. It was out for blood. The attack, it was just too vicious, too deliberate. It was not there to lend us a hand. That crocodile just happened to be the easiest thing in its path. Maybe it noticed us. Maybe it knew we were in the tent and we were just too much of a hassle to get to. Maybe it didn't know. I don't know. Those questions, they do trouble me though, thinking back. The incident led me to look deeper into Aussie monster stories, to the point that I now have a pretty high level of confidence that what we saw was the Malingi. The First Nations people will tell you stories about him. They too know that he is not a friend. It's actually, at its roots, a bit of a bedtime story that they would use to scare the kids out of wandering off alone. But like all of their tales, it is deeply steeped in reality. Well, I know now for sure that this one is. I don't go to that spot anymore. Far as I'm concerned, that's his territory, and he can keep it. I do warn others about what we saw that night. Tried to tell our parents about what we saw. But of course, they brushed it off as a scared kid's imagination. I've not heard of any more attacks or run-ins with him, and I'm glad for that. I'd rather not be proven right on this one.
After reading all the anecdotes on here, I wanted to write down one of my own experiences that still freaks me out just thinking about it. Just down the road from where a few years ago I had previously lived in Southeast Australia, is the opening into about 100 acres of woodlands and bush that I frequently went into when I was younger to do the usual things, riding and camping, etc. I was out driving at around 11:30 p.m. with my girlfriend, and as we were in the area, I decided to show her the woodlands, as she loves everything to do with nature, and it was summer, so it was an extremely warm night. I left my car with the lights shining into the trees, as we weren't going too far in, and it was pitch black inside. The two of us just kind of sat, chatting, having a smoke and generally relaxing. She was sitting on a sort of a map of the area, and I was keeping an eye on the trees as I had a feeling that something was just wrong. I read on here a few people have said that they have felt that they were in danger, although nothing around them was off, and it was the same feeling. Every sense was almost reaching out, and my adrenaline was up, but there wasn't really anything in my eyeline that seemed any different. After lighting another cigarette to calm my nerves, I scanned the tree line again, and realized that it looked different to before. It was only after staring into the dark that I saw that there was moonlight now, lighting up grass where it couldn't before, as there was a black shape blocking it, which, before, I thought was a tree. I've got goosebumps just typing this, but the only way to describe was that all sound just ceased, and everything went dead silent. A few seconds later, this disgusting feeling of dread fell over me, and I saw motion in the dark of the path, as this thing crawled towards us on all fours. I've seen nearly every animal in the outback here, and we don't have any large predators like in the US or Europe, but somehow I knew this thing was a predator, and it wasn't hiding itself from us, but just slowly crawling forward towards us. I don't know if my girlfriend saw it or not, as I couldn't look away, but just as it reached the line my car lights were able to illuminate, it reared up onto two legs and just sat, staring at us. I'm 6'4", and this thing was about another meter larger than me, with arms that were far too long that reached down near the ground. All I could make out was an off-white, almost yellowish fur on it, and in the dim light could make out the silhouette of its head as like a dog or wolf. I wasn't able to move as it stared at me, but it was at this point my girlfriend gasped, which seemed to break whatever was stopping me from thinking logically. I grabbed her by the arm and sprinted to my car, slammed the doors and tore out of there as fast as I could, both of us too scared to speak until about half an hour later. We've both discussed it many times, and the feeling that we had was what I imagine a rabbit feels when it catches a wolf or fox looking at it. That this is something that would be able to end us with absolute ease if it chose. Neither of us have been able to come up with any explanation for what it was, but it has definitely changed the way I view the woods and bush, and when I go camping or hiking now, I think back to that and wonder what it was, and if I will ever see anything like it again.
I've been all around Australia. Take my word for it, the best way to see this country is by car. There's just so many little hidden secrets and pockets of paradise you miss if you try to do it all by bus or simply jetting between the major cities. My memories of road tripping Australia are, for the most part, positive. Sure, there's been some ups and downs, but that's life, isn't it? You just keep on pushing forward. And that's what I did. There is one notable stopover that still stands out though. An event which very nearly convinced me to pack in my adventurous spirit for good. I will recount this as best I can. This was sometime around late September. I was headed from Barrage Bay up to Narooma. It's a gorgeous coastal drive for the most part, aside from one little detour inland as you pass Wallaga Lake. The best part of road tripping is the impulsivity, especially when you're driving a fully equipped camper van like me. You can pull in just about anywhere for a break, as long as the area you're pulling up at isn't illegal for camping and whatnot. And so I did, as I came around the bending roads of that beautiful lakeside drive. I found this picture-perfect spot to camp out for the night. Remote, peaceful, just the way I liked it. I set up my camp, got a hot pot of coffee going, and kicked back in the deck chair, soaking up the sun. I got there right on sunset, so it was absolutely ideal. September can be a little bit warmer, but in the mornings and in the evenings that time of year, you won't find better weather down under. I was gazing out over the crystal clear blue waters when I heard someone speaking. They said. This startled me. It was not a language I recognized, and there was no one around. Well, there certainly was not a moment ago anyway. Again, that same voice. That's when I realized there was no one around. I was hearing this voice in my head. Bloody hell, I must be out of it. It has been a long drive. Louder this time, and sending shockwaves through my head. Every time it spoke out, it was like the kick of a bass drum reverberating from the inside of my brain. It hurt. That's when shit got real bizarre. 3 kids came tearing out of the bush, breaking the tree line right behind my camper. They were shouting at me, pointing to the road, screaming, "Go, go, leave now." The kids were clearly indigenous. Don't get the wrong idea, I don't mean some stereotypical image of indigenous Australian tribes living deep in the bush. They were just some local kids from a nearby camp. They sure seemed to know something I didn't though, and it didn't sound good. I decided that I'd best heed their advice. This, coupled with that weird voice, was giving me a bad feeling. I packed up my stuff and I scrambled back inside my camper. I strapped into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and flicked on the high beams. As I did so, they shot straight into the dark bushland ahead and illuminated something massive. It was huge. I shit you not, 12 foot at the bare minimum. It had an almost spider-like appearance. Its arms and legs stuck straight out to the sides. Its face was pale white. You ever see those Slender Man stories? Kinda like him, but with a nasty look on his face. His eyes were beady and black, and its body, it was just like a shadowy mass. In my head, a voice, like before, but it said no words, just a low growl. The kids started bashing and kicking my camper now, but not as if they meant me harm or anything. They were urging me to leave. They screamed something out at me, a word I'll never forget. Doolagal, Doolagal. Again, that voice from before. but much louder this time, echoed through my head.
Awaranani.
I watched as this thing slowly, yet deliberately, pivoted on its right foot and then began walking sideways towards my car. That was it. I was out. I stepped on the pedal and floored it down the highway. As I sped off down that road, I caught a glimpse of this abomination wobbling sideways, step by step. It was coming down the highway, following my car. Thankfully, for whatever reason, it did not appear capable of picking up any kind of speed, and I watched as it slowly disappeared into the darkness of the night. That was the first and last time that I've ever seen anything in my travels I would call otherworldly. I did not need to look very far for answers as to what I bore witness to that dark September night. A simple search for a single word those kids shouted at me turned up everything I needed to know. Doolagal. Straight out of Wikipedia, the Doolagal is a humanoid creature of Aboriginal dreamings. He is said to have bright, red eyes, and he stalks Mount Goolaga, walking sideways. See, where I was camped, it was a straight shot south from Mount Goolaga. So, I guess it fits. Why he was down by the lakeside when he's said to stalk the mountain, I don't know. Maybe he sees all this land surrounding the mountain as his territory. Maybe he was on the hunt. I don't know. The search did lead me to look into another phrase I heard that night. The words which constantly reverberated inside my mind. From what I could dig up, this is of the Gunyandi language, and it loosely translates to, "Please, go." What I can't figure out is whether this voice in my head was this Doolagal, or if it was something else. This Doolagal, it did not appear to have my best interest in mind. No, everything about its demeanor looked as though it meant me harm. The actions of the kids too, they were frantically urging me to get out. Like they knew if I stayed there, something bad would happen. If it weren't for them, maybe it would have. But nah, I don't reckon it was that Doolagal talking to me that night. He would have been quite happy to sneak right up on me. Still to this day, I can't shake that image of that awkward, sideways walk as he lumbered out from those trees.
Okay, so I live in Australia. It's currently autumn, and I live on the outskirts of a major city, still in the suburbs. This happened today in the late afternoon when I went to hang some washing on the line under our carport attached to the side of our house. We were starting to lose daylight, so I thought I'd quickly pop out and hang up the last of the washing for the day. It was increasingly getting darker by the minute. I had just begun hanging clothes when I started to get an uneasy feeling. I'm unsure why. I brushed it off as I was losing daylight quickly. A minute later, I heard a group of kids up the other end of the street, screaming, and then silence. Again, I brushed it off as the kids just being kids and playing with each other. The intensity of unease grew, and I felt like I was being watched. I then heard a low growl, which was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and the air got significantly colder, and all the crickets and bugs went silent. I moved the clothes rack to outside the carport so I could use what little light there was to hurry this up as much as possible. While hanging and scanning around between picking up the next piece of clothing, I noticed something new. This dense garden that wrapped around our U-shaped drive looked poor, like maybe it had been trampled in a decent section, maybe 13 feet of garden. I intensely felt I was really being watched by something, and right before finishing the clothes, the feeling started to ease off a little, and it began to warm back up, like it was when I initially came outside. I was raised with big dogs, Rottweilers, German Shepherds, etc., and grew up in rural countryside. I've heard all kinds of animal sounds, from wild dogs, foxes, koalas fighting, possums and bats. I've never in my life heard a growl like this before. I don't know how to explain it, but it did not sound natural. It sounded closest to a dog, but something about it was very wrong. Before going outside, my indoor cat desperately wanted outside. Once I came inside, she was acting completely different, sulking around and all fur puffed up. She then was following me at my ankles around the house, which is not normal for her. We have a lot of bushland surrounding us and live next to a river, which is behind us. I don't fish in that river anymore, as I've always felt like something was around. I have a few more experiences. The first one is back in 2015 in December, around Christmas. My boyfriend at the time, now ex, invited my family to have a Christmas dinner at their house, and we were coming home after spending time there for quite a few hours. We both lived in small, separate, rural towns, and it took 25 minutes to drive, doing a speed limit of 100 km per hour to get to his. In between was nothing, except large acres of land owned mostly by farmers and the occasional house, but extremely spread out. This is your typical Aussie countryside, with overgrown dead tall grass lining the sides of the bitumen roads, filled with tall eucalyptus trees on both sides. Driving back in the dark, we automatically do 20 k's under the speed limit, due to the wallabies and roos. They have a bad habit of darting across right in front of cars and blend in well with the tall dead grass. Instinctively, we continuously are scanning the sides of the road and paddocks to see if there was any wildlife we need to slow down or stop for. I was in the front passenger seat, closest to the side of the road, when it was pitch black and we were in the dead middle of nowhere at the halfway mark towards home. I saw this huge black animal, sort of running, kind of across how a bear and a gorilla would run. This thing was keeping pace with our car, a big dual cab ute, doing 80 k's. It looked like a bear, crossed with something, but seriously deranged. When I fully looked at it, it looked straight at me, and its eyes glowed red. I let out what my mother described as a blood-curdling scream, and she reacted by slamming the brakes, thinking we were about to hit something. As she was nearly at a complete halt, she turned to me and asked, "What? What is it? What are we slowing down for?" I yelled at her out of panic, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And then I yelled at her, "Don't stop, keep driving now." She started speeding up again, and at this point the thing had vanished, and I started telling her what I saw. She thought I was making it up, and thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, as in Australia we don't have bears or anything like what I saw. Years later I did some research, and turns out yowies have been reported to have red eyes when reflecting light, which shared a shocking resemblance to what I remember seeing that night. At least, I hope that is what I saw, and not something more sinister. Second experience. I was again coming back from spending a few days for Christmas with my now partner's family. I was driving back home. His family lived in a major city, and we still were living out in the country, so this was a 3-hour drive. Mostly 100 km/h roads, except for exiting through the city. About an hour and a half away from home, We were in the middle of nowhere, going up a tightly winding mountain range, thick with native forestry. My partner needed to take a leak, so the next dirt road I could find off the side I drove down. Most dirt roads are single lane, and here we move off onto the shoulder if someone is coming the opposite direction. But we were absolutely nowhere, and that chance was almost next to none. I was looking for a spot that I could pull over, but did not expect this dirt road to keep going and going and going. No houses in sight at all, and there hadn't been for a very long time prior to pulling into this road. After about 15 minutes, I find the only spot I could possibly park and pull a very tight U-turn and park up. We decide the area is lovely, surrounded by bushland and tall trees. It was afternoon, but still plenty of light, although the sun was starting to set. So we decided to kill the engine and hang out for a bit to enjoy the scenery. My partner finishes his business, and I step out to join him. We had been trying to start a family for a few months now, but it did not seem to be going well for us. We were both wanting some us time to take our minds off things and have a break from life. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, somewhere in the distance, we both hear a baby's crying. There were no houses, no people as far as the eye could see, and it sounded to be coming from the bushland. Only there was a steep, gradual decline down to the bushland off the road. We both verified what we had heard, and that we are hearing what we think we are. I worried initially about what if someone has dumped a baby, this area being so deserted. Then we both get an immense, sickening feeling of overwhelming fear and dread as the crying continues and gets significantly louder and closer within a few seconds. We both get in the car as quickly as humanly possible, and without losing traction, we get out of there as fast as I can safely. We both had an intense feeling in the pit of our stomachs that we should not be there and needed to get out. To add to the strangeness, turns out I found out 2 months later I was pregnant, and would have been pregnant at the time we had that experience. I would have reported the baby crying, but 1, no phone signal. 2, this road did not have a name and was not signed. And 3, there was no way someone could have gotten down there alive, also while carrying a baby. And there was no tracks, tie marks, footprints, zip, zilch, nothing. It was 1995. My family and I moved to a new house in a fairly new suburb at the time. My parents thought of it as the perfect split-level house, spacious and family-friendly, even with an outdoor spa. They bought the house as second owners from a couple with 3 kids who were divorcing. We were a happy family. From the first day we moved in, my parents complained about bees in a wall. They had a pest removalist come and exterminate the bees. Same night, my mum had a dream of a woman with long black hair and a red dress chasing her. She didn't think too much of it, as it was just a dream. Had a cousin come stay with us from overseas a year later, and we recently found out he told another family member after going back to his country about seeing a lady at ours. He gave the same description as what my mum saw. After that, weird things started happening. My dad had troubles as his close-knit brothers and a sister who came to our house with their families almost every weekend turned on him without warning. His personality gradually changed as he became arrogant and angry. He died young and suddenly at home in 2001, which forced us to move house. Our front pergola caved in. I was having issues at school. My brother was always sick, and the birds in our aviary were dying, one by one, even after my dad just bought them as young ones. I had even seen a faint spectre of a woman from the dining room upon coming home from school by the front door. I stared at it until it disappeared through the front door as soon as my dad came home from work. Last night in our home, my mum dreamt of the same woman again, saying goodbye. At our new house, no issues. We heard from our old neighbors that our next door neighbor's granddaughter took her own life on their property. 6 degrees of separation. I eventually worked with a lady whose son married one of the 3 girls of the divorced couple who sold us the house. Her daughter-in-law's mother relayed information through her that confirmed my suspicions too. I have since been doing research via libraries and the local council for information, as I'm still intrigued to this day. So it makes me question, what happened on the property or land before the house was built? Was there a murder that took place there? Or even the woman's body buried beneath the house? Was the woman's intent to ruin people's happiness? Did my dad get possessed by something? How are the owners who bought from us going with their experiences there?
About 3 years ago, my mate Peter and I decided to go stay out at my nan and pop's farm, which is located just outside of Bathurst, New South Wales. About a 20-minute drive. The farm's name is Clear Creek. Now, there are quite a few ghost stories out there, considering my distant relatives built the farmhouse 300 years ago. From hearing all of these stories, we decided that we would go and investigate for ourselves. Me personally, I believe in the spirit world. However, Peter did not. There was one story about a paddock which we called the corn paddock. According to stories, 100 or so First Nations people lost their lives in that paddock, back when the Aboriginal people were kept as slaves to the white man. We decided we were going to camp in that paddock. About 3 hours after the sun had gone down, we were sitting around a campfire. We were just beginning to get ourselves warm when we heard someone or something moving in the bushes behind us. We decided to take a look to see what it was, but nothing was there. We retreated back to our campfire to talk about some of the stories we had heard. After about an hour or so, we were just about ready to go to bed when we heard the same kind of movement behind us. This time, we decided to ignore it. But my friend Peter, the absolute dickhead, decided for some stupid reason to shout out loud, "I mock thy spirits." After he had said that, I had a go at him, told him that spirits are not to be messed with, and this stuff should be treated with respect. With that, a slow wind started to blow, which sent a shiver down my spine. The wind started to pick up and get heavier. With that, we decided to go for cover in the tent we had set up. Almost right away, we heard a woman scream. It was a sickening, ear-piercing scream. After that, myself and Peter decided not to tempt fate any further, and we ran all the way home.
When I was a teenager, like 13 or 14 years old, one of my mates from school lived in a kind of rural area. It's hard to describe. We lived in the suburbs, but his area was a little further out and less suburban looking at the time. This was 25 years ago. It was kind of suburbs, but hilly and surrounded by forest. I went to his place to stay from time to time because there was always adventures to be had around his place. One day, he mentions that there are caves near his house. old mine shafts, to be more precise. They were in a kind of national park. I was super interested to go check them out with him, so we planned to go the following weekend, and I'd stay over the night before, so we could set out early the next morning. The weekend came around, and we set out around 8 a.m. We went to the supermarket on the way to stock up on drinks and snacks, and made our way to the caves. The national park was huge and beautiful. It was a great morning for a hike too. Not too hot and not too cold, with a nice blue-skied sunny day. We came to our first cave in the first 20 minutes of hiking. We grabbed our torches, or flashlights, and went in. It was only short, ending in a small chamber. At the far end of the chamber was a sturdy, locked cage-type gate. My friend told me some were locked off due to the very real chance of cave-ins or flooding on the lower levels. Since the cave wasn't too long, it wasn't too dark. With a small amount of sunlight coming in from the entryway, we took a break and sat and ate some snacks. It was good being out and about. I was never a fan of early mornings, but this was an exception. We resumed our trip after that short break and came across several more similar caves. There were a few longer ones with evidence of people using them for underage drinking. Candles and beer cans coupled with shitty teenage graffiti. But these were an exception, and not too bad. For the most part, people seemed to respect the caves to an extent, and cleaned up after themselves. After about an hour and a half, we came across one that was a bit different from the others. It was a longer one, but evidence of people using it for anything was minimal. I was too embarrassed to say so at the time, but I got a really weird feeling when we entered it. It was weird because we had been in so many, and I felt nothing, but this just made me feel uneasy. I looked at my mate, and he seemed fine, so I didn't say anything, not wanting to appear soft. When we got to the end, where the metal gate was, we found that it was unlocked and open. In fact, when we got closer, the wind seemed to blow it open slightly, although I didn't feel any wind. I got a chill up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like something was inviting us in. Without hesitating, my mate was like, "Let's go." I was a little taken aback. How could he not be picking up on the bad vibes here? But I ended up not saying anything, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid and didn't want him hassling me later about it. I regret this now. So, in we went. It was so dark in there. Our flashlights barely lit a couple of meters ahead of us. The tunnel seemed to go on and on. There was zero evidence of anyone having been there. "What do you think we'll find?" my friend whispered to me. "Dunno," I managed to mumble out. Unease was really starting to hit me now, to the point that I was beginning to feel nauseous. And then, it got worse. I felt wind start to blow around my ankles. At first I paid it no mind, but then I thought, where is this sudden wind coming from? The temperature seemed to get colder at each step too. Then, I felt the wind brush past my shoulder and face. My heart was beating so hard that I imagined it was echoing in the tunnel. Then, I started hearing whispering all around me. It was faint and hard to work out the words. I stopped in my tracks and listened. When I stopped, it seemed to stop too. And then the most bone-chilling sound I had ever heard could be heard in the distance in front of us. Low at first, but deafeningly loud in no time. It was the bellowing scream of a man. One at first, but then I could make out multiple voices. I felt what felt like hands start to grab at me, and I could take it no more. I took off in a sprint, back towards the exit. I could only half see the way because my hand that was holding the flashlight was pumping up and down so hard, as it does when you sprint. I scraped my arms, legs and shoulder against the rough rock walls several times, but I didn't care. It felt like I was running endlessly, but eventually, I reached the gate, which I collided into. I thought it would be open, but for some reason it was shut. In my panic, I couldn't seem to work out how to open it. Eventually, I managed, and it swung towards me, and I left. My friend, not far behind me. We finally got out and kept running until we realized we were out. Upon realizing this, we collapsed into an exhausted heap, struggling to regain our breath. I'm not proud of this, but I also vomited on myself due to the overexertion. It was my only shirt for that weekend too, and I had to borrow one of my mates while we cleaned up mine in secret, because for some reason, we thought we'd be in trouble. Just before we got up and left the area where we collapsed, I took one look back at the cave. It was kinda involuntary. I wasn't even thinking about it. When my eyes landed on the cave entrance, I swear I could see a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, staring at us. I shot a look at my mate, and he saw it too. I was this close to puking again, but I managed to hold it down. We got up and hurriedly left the area. That was enough adventure for one day. We went back there a year or so later for nostalgia's sake. We also felt bigger and tougher. That particular cave was heavily locked off, with no trespassing signs on it, threatening hefty fines. Probably for the best thinking back. Teenage bravado makes young boys do stupid things sometimes, and we may not have escaped so easily a second time.
I was staying at my grandparents' place, which is where my auntie and her 2 children also live. My auntie was due to go into hospital the next day, so myself and another of my cousins were staying to help out the 2 kids because my nan and pop were away at the time. There are 3 rooms in this house, all closely located. My cousin Stephen was to sleep in his own room, further from where I was sleeping in my cousin Kate's room. Kate was going to sleep in my nan and pop's room with my other cousin, Rachel. My aunt was going to sleep on the couch as she didn't want to wake anyone, getting up every 5 minutes to go to the loo. Everyone was getting ready for bed and I was laying on Kate's bed, waiting for my aunt to turn out the light for me. I was like 11 at the time. As I lay there, with my eyes closed, I could feel this pouring sensation at the end of my legs. They had several dogs and cats. I assumed it was one of them. But when I looked up to see which one it was, there was nothing there. But I could still feel that sensation. Then my aunt came to the door and handed me their new little kitten to sleep with and turned out the light. I was a bit freaked out now, so I laid there, patting the cat who was staring up at the wall behind my head. The cat then flipped out and took off out of the room as the door was open. I looked up and felt strangely cold. This was strange because it was still summer and it was very hot. Her bed was placed next to a window. You could hear everything that was going on outside. I was still trying to sleep when I heard the sound of 2 men talking outside. At first, I thought it was someone walking past the yard's fence, but I realized that the language they were using, it was too formal to be anyone who lived in this area. I looked outside to see who it was, but there was no one there. But still, I could hear the 2 men talking. As I laid back down, my cousin Kate scared me because I was really freaked out now and could just make out her outline. It was very dark in the hall. I yelled at her and chased her out of the room, back into where she was sleeping, and I shut the door to that room. I laid back down on my bed and I could not sleep. I could no longer hear the two men talking, but I felt cold again. I was going to get up to go find another blanket and looked over towards the doorway where the light switch was next to. In the doorway, I could once again make out the outline of a little girl. I froze because I knew it couldn't be my cousin Kate, as the girl had much longer hair and was shorter than Kate. Also, the doors in my Nan and Pop's house, they squeak very loudly if they're opened or closed. And I had heard nothing, so she couldn't have opened the door again. When I realized that this was not Kate, I looked at the figure who had something gleaming in her hand. I thought this to be a long knife blade. The figure then slowly moved in towards me, and as it did, I screamed as loudly as I could for my aunt to come. My auntie came quickly and turned on the light, asking me what was wrong. I just ignored her and jumped out of the bed, ran into where my cousin Kate was sleeping. It definitely wasn't Kate, because she was dead asleep. Totally freaked out, I refused to sleep in that room, and I went into the kitchen at the other end of the house with my aunt while she had a smoke. She then needed to use the loo again and left me standing there. I then noticed her dog sitting at my feet, so I bent down to pat him, and as I did, I felt the hand of someone rub my back. It didn't feel wrong though. It was like they were reassuring me that I was okay. When I stood up, no one was there. To this day, I still will not sleep in that room. And Kate has also seen and heard things in there.
So, the first experience happened when I was 7 or 8 years old, and we lived in a suburb called Malden in Darwin, Northern Territory. There were these Aboriginals from a community called Maningrida that lived up the road from us, and they were notorious for having a lot of domestic violence and always having cops and ambulances over their house. What happens when the families fight is that they start doing black magic on each other and sending evil spirits and curses to each other. One night, the cats and dogs in the neighborhood were extremely vocal. The dogs couldn't stop barking, and the cats are meowing and running from drain to drain, trying to find somewhere to hide. This went on for a good 4 hours until about 12 to 1 a.m. Me and my mum were sleeping, and my sister came running into the house saying, "Get up, there is an alien ship outside." We get up and go outside, and fair enough, there is something that's silver-colored and shaped like a typical saucer, as you see in the movies, right above the Aboriginal's house. It had lights underneath it and projecting onto the ground, going in circles. They were a light blue color, and from the outside going into the center. It was biggest to smallest, and they were circular shaped. The lights just kept twirling around, and I wish I took a video, but back then phones weren't very common, and even if you did have a good phone, the camera quality was terrible in the early 2000s. It stayed there for a very long time, and then left. The next day, we heard of kids that had followed it on their BMX bikes from different suburbs away. This wasn't the only time it happened. It happened at least twice, and every single time it would start off with the dogs and the cats in the neighborhood going crazy. I know it wasn't a fake prop because of the animals, and at least 7 to 10 other witnesses had seen it. I seen a video on YouTube of cats sensing earthquakes before they hit because they have supersonic hearing, and I've also heard that before a natural catastrophe like a flood happens, animals will seek high ground a day before it happens. They know things that we don't for sure. The second weird thing that I seen was when we made a trip to Alice Springs. My sister was dating one of the boys that were from that house and that family. When we were in Alice Springs late at night, we happened to see another weird thing, which very closely resembles the old PS2 startup screen with the colored balls twirling around each other. There was 4 lights, colored orange, green, blue, and red, just twirling around each other in a pattern, maybe 12 feet in the air. It was so strange for it to be so prominent and just stay there for a long time doing it and allowing us to see it. My sister told me 15 years later that the reason the lights were following us was because her boyfriend had a curse on him. He was an accessory to a murder. He had given one of his relatives an axe to go and kill his wife, and the lights had followed us 1,500 plus kilometers all the way from Darwin. The third time was at my property in Berry Springs, maybe 60 kilometers out of Darwin City. A lot of people started telling us that they see lights on our property, and it's a rural property with lots of land because I'm a traditional owner. We thought it was thieves trying to come onto our property with flashlights and steal stuff while we were sleeping. I was around 11 to 12 years old when I saw the light for myself. It was late at night again, and I was going down the stairs because the toilet in the house is broken and I had to use the outside toilet. About 30 meters away, underneath a mango tree, I see a faint light, like an old torch when it loses its battery, and it starts to turn brown. I was about to yell out because I thought I was about to catch a thief, but very quickly I realized that it was gliding and sort of bobbing up and down, and maybe it noticed that I saw it. So the light went from a dim brown color to an immaculate gold color. I can't even describe the color, but it was like a small piece of the sun right in front of me at night. It's like when you see a lightning strike at night and it lights up the entire area around it. Well, I saw it in a compact ball, the size of a basketball. There is no man-made thing in this world that could match the brightness that I saw that night. It was incredibly bright. It opened my brain up to a whole new brightness that I've never seen in my life. It was kind of like a human spirit because it turned the corner as if it was walking. It didn't go through the wall that was nearby, and it stayed on the footpath. I would have stayed and stared at it, heading into the opposite direction, but as soon as I seen it turn the corner, I immediately thought that it could easily turn back around and come charging straight at me. I got incredibly scared and ran back up the stairs, and what made it worse was that I was home alone and couldn't go outside to pee. There is a common name for these lights called min lights, but I'm not sure if that's what I seen that night because I've heard of people seeing the lights that were either green or red, but this one was a strange type of golden that I'd never seen on this earth. The fourth time was when my uncle was dating an Aboriginal woman from a community called Borroloola, and she had a niece whom my sister befriended. There were these things called hairy men. They are ugly little creatures that can pop into the spiritual realm and our realm. Kids are given these creatures as protectors apparently, and they can hop into their owner's body and help them fight. My sister and a friend that lived with us was stupid enough to accept one of these creatures as a friend. And that's when a lot of crazy things started happening in the house. For example, as we were taking showers, we would hear little giggles and knocks on the door. My mum would fall asleep on the lounge and wake up in a whole different spot at the front door. There was lots of other things that happened that I can't remember because this was at least 13 years ago. We were eating dinner one night, and for some reason, they loved coming out and tormenting us when it was a stormy night and raining heavily. Well, I happened to see one of its faces just peeking up from under the table looking at our food. I got a very quick glimpse of it. It had pale skin, a scar on its face going from top to bottom, and black hair that was very thin and horse-like. Immediately, I got up and screamed, and threw the ashtray at it, but it disappeared. We left the house that night, and the next day all of our plates had no food on it. We had to go into town and find some Aboriginal men that knew how to get rid of these things through black magic. They came to the house, and were doing all kinds of chants and rituals, and we even heard it in a bush nearby, and one of the guys threw a rock at it, and it made a dull thumping sound as if it hit flesh. And that was the last time we ever had any more paranormal experiences from them. When they were in our house, before the men came, I experienced my 4th paranormal encounter. We all started sleeping together in the lounge room because we were too scared to sleep alone, for obvious reasons. I was the only one awake, and I couldn't help but feel there was a presence in the house. I stayed up for maybe 4 hours, looking around the room because I felt like it could pop up out of nowhere, and I would easily see it. Well, it didn't show itself to me that night, but what it did do is start slamming the cupboard doors violently, at least 6 times. I literally didn't hear any footsteps in the house that night, but it was just on the other side of the wall, slamming the cupboards really hard like it was angry. And that was the most frightening experience of my life because I was the only person experiencing this. It's true that your fear feeds evil entities because I was scared that night and was really focusing on it, giving it my energy. It was really hard to go to sleep that night knowing that this thing had physical strength, but I did end up going to sleep out of pure exhaustion from staying up really late. All these experiences have helped me build my faith in becoming a Christian man because I know for sure that demons exist.
My partner and I, we moved into an old army barracks that was over 150 years old. It was, over time, turned into 4 conjoining homes. A lot of deaths had occurred there. The only reason that the house came up for rent was because the girl who lived there before us overdosed and died. It happened in our bedroom. My partner worked shift work 5 to 6 nights a week between the hours of 9 p.m. and could work up until 6 a.m. the next morning. When my partner would get home from work, I would always hear her coming in the door, and then she would come into the bedroom and kiss me. Some nights I had woken up to her just sitting on the side of the bed, looking at me. One night, I had the feeling that someone was in the room. I just assumed it was my partner, coming home from work. So I opened my eyes a bit, and there was this thing right in my face. I screamed, and just as a reaction, I swung my arm in its direction, and during this time, I had squeezed my eyes shut. But it was only for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, the black thing was gone. But I had woken up my partner, who I then remembered had not worked that night. She then said that something had suddenly woken her up only 10 minutes earlier. I would always leave the light on in the lounge room because I didn't want to be in that house in the dark. The light from the lounge room, it would light up our bedroom. I knew that this thing was not just a shadow. Also, due to my partner working night shift, I was often in bed alone, and I frequently got that feeling that I was not the only one in the room. If I ever had the feeling that I was not alone, then I would feel that They were standing beside the bed, looking at me. I would always turn around and face the wall, try to get to sleep that way. I just used to put it down that they were keeping me company while I was alone in the house. But I don't think that's true. It scared the hell out of me.
Okay, so these are my experiences of when I was growing up in a house so blatantly haunted. My friends only ever stayed over once. Might as well start at the daily occurrences. For context, the house was raised, so we had a garage and basically storage under the living space at ground level, so no animals walking on the ground and making noise in the house stuff. So we had the footsteps walking down the hall when there was only me in the house. The pantry door being open every morning. Dad would be up at like 4 a.m. to get ready for work, and it would be open, so he'd close it and blamed it on me for some time. Okay, so now onto the more wild stuff. I was hanging out with a mate of mine, and we made our way back to my place, and I realized I didn't have a key. So I asked him to just wait at the front door, and I'd go to the back door. We never bothered to lock the back door because we had a neo-mastiff. So I went around back, walked up the stairs and opened the door to the kitchen, and directly in front of me was a T-intersecting hallway and a shadow projected onto the wall. So first, the sun was a solid 90 degrees to the side of where the shadow could be mine. Second, it was standing full height from the door, and as I moved, it didn't. So I froze, and as my mind was processing what I was seeing, it turned and bolted towards the living room and front door. And yes, I both heard and felt the footfalls. So in that moment, my mind shifted from shadow to intruder, and I ran after it. I'm talking like 2 meters across the kitchen and about 3 to the living room. And I remember my friend was at the door waiting for me, so I just made for the door and realized there was nobody around. I opened the door and told my friend there might be something hiding right here, so help me check. Still nothing. Short one this time. Sitting at the computer at about 1 to 2 a.m. Felt a hot breath blow across the back of my neck. Jumped out of my skin with that one. I have 2 younger sisters, and I was watching TV with one of them in the living room, and decided I had enough and was going to bed. So got up and said goodnight. Started walking to my room, and at the end of the hall was a young girl in white PJs. And I just thought it was their younger sister and gave it no more thought for about 3 more steps, till I reached her doorway and she was sitting there, playing a Naruto game on the old PS2. That's when I looked back up the hall, and it was empty. I remember muttering, "Damn it, Bob." At this point, we had long since started calling the ghost Bob, just so we had something to call it. The fated friends night over, so not much happened for most of the night, till we decided that it was bedtime. We were 19 at the time. Anyway, it was the following morning when I got up and went to the living room where my mate had slept, and he looked like hell. Our lights had an afterglow function, so you could see for a few minutes after turning them off. Well, apparently, about an hour after I'd buggered off to bed, the lights clicked twice, and the blue glow clicked on, and that stirred him awake, thinking one of us was up. Then the front door started rattling in the frame like someone was outside, pushing and pulling on it. That eventually stopped, and not long after, he heard the footsteps going from the door, down the hall and back for some time. He said he pulled the blanket up over his head when the door started banging, and wasn't game enough to pull it down to see what was walking around. He flatly refused to stay a single night ever again in that house. This is just a snapshot of the shenanigans that we experienced in that house, but they are also the most memorable. About 20 years ago, I agreed to house sit for a family friend of a friend in Warrandyte, Victoria. I was in my early 30s, looking to make some extra cash, and the idea of a few quiet days in a peaceful suburb seemed perfect. Warrandyte was a far cry from the relatively subdued streets of Box Hill where I usually lived. I wasn't used to the quiet or the isolation, but I figured I could use a break. The house was nestled at the end of a long driveway on a tree-lined street with very few neighbors in sight. It had a rustic charm, typical of the area, surrounded by bushland and offering a view of the Yarra River. The owners showed me around before they left for their holiday, giving me a set of keys and a quick rundown of the house's quirks. Everything seemed normal at first. The first couple of nights passed without incident. I enjoyed the tranquility, noting how different it was from the more settled environment of Box Hill. I spent my evenings reading in the living room, occasionally glancing at the large windows at the darkening bush. But by the third night, things started getting strange. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, when I heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the house settling or perhaps an animal outside. But then it happened again. The same distinct thud. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way upstairs. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. I checked the rooms one by one, but everything was in its place. I tried to shake off the unease as I returned downstairs, just trying to chalk it up to my not being used to such country quiet. That night, as I lay in bed, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were soft but unmistakable, moving closer and closer to my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen with fear. The footsteps paused right outside my door, then continued down the hall. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The following day, I tried to dismiss the incident, attributing it to the house's age or maybe my overactive imagination. But that evening, things escalated. As I was preparing dinner, the TV in the living room suddenly turned on by itself, blaring static at full volume. I rushed in, fumbled for the remote, and managed to turn it off. This incident left me shaken, but I tried to laugh it off, blaming the power surge or a faulty remote. The most unsettling event happened a few days later while I was taking a bath. The house was quiet, the warm water relaxing me after a long day. Suddenly, the temperature in the bathroom dropped drastically. I could see my breath condensing in the air. Then, I heard a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible. It was like someone was standing right behind me, murmuring in my ear. I jumped out of the tub, wrapped myself in a towel, and fled to the bedroom where I stayed under the covers till morning. I considered leaving, but I didn't want to abandon my responsibility without a good reason. However, the final straw came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen again, this time making a sandwich. Without warning, the cabinets began to shake, and the plates inside started to rattle. The lights flickered, and I heard a loud crash as a picture frame fell off the wall. Before I could react, a cabinet door flew open, and dishes started flying out, smashing against the counter and the floor. The air filled with the sound of breaking glass, and a faint, almost mocking whisper. I stood there, paralyzed as the chaos unfolded around me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house fell silent, but the damage was done. I packed my things that night. I called the homeowners the next morning, apologizing profusely and citing a family emergency. To my surprise, they seemed understanding. They didn't ask too many questions, and I found myself wondering if they knew more about the house than they had let on. It's been nearly 20 years, and I still think back to that week in Warrandyte. Sometimes, it's better not to ask the questions you don't want the answers to.
When I was a young boy living in Australia, I was a very light sleeper. Very sensitive too. If someone entered my room whilst I was asleep, they would wake me up, even if they were trying to be quiet. I would also somehow know whether it was my mum or dad or one of my two sisters. I mean, as soon as I woke up, I would know exactly which family member was in my room. Twice I was woken in the middle of the night, and my gift failed me. I don't recall how young I was at the time, but I was easily under 10 years of age. The first time I woke up and opened my eyes, I was looking straight into the face of a figure leaning over me. I say face because it was leaning over me, but truth be told, I couldn't see a face or make out any distinguishing features at all. It was just a dark shape leaning over my bed. I do not believe it was my father, although he was a big man, and this figure leaning over me was large as well. It just didn't feel like my father. My reaction at finding a stranger leaning over me in the middle of the night was immediate and frantic. I grabbed my teddy bear, yanked the covers over my head, and I burrowed down to the foot of my bed. If it had been my father checking on me, I'd like to think he would have responded to this reaction by letting me know it was him and seeking to calm me down. But there was no such fatherly reassurances that night. I distinctly remember the next morning asking my mum if she or dad had come into my room to check on me. I know they used to do that, but it was never anything more than opening my door and peeking in, which would still wake me up. This was someone who had entered my room and been leaning over me with their face barely a foot or so from mine. And they hadn't been a family member. A year or two later, I'm unclear on my exact age at the time. I'm 38 now, so we're going back probably a good 30 years or so. This night, I was again awoken in the middle of the night. When I woke up, I could sense something standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Again, if either of my parents had been checking on me, they would have done nothing more than popped their head in the door. But this thing was standing at the foot of my bed, and it didn't feel right. Oddly enough, despite there being a street light right outside my bedroom window, and despite having excellent night vision, my room was pitch black and I couldn't see a thing. But I knew someone was there in the darkness. I could feel them, and it terrified me. I have since spoken with other people who have had visitors in the night. People I personally know and trust. And they've all been able to describe their visitor, their features, clothing, everything. They've also told me that while they were a little disturbed to wake up and find someone watching over them, that they also felt calm and at peace. Like somehow they knew their visitor meant them no harm. My midnight visitors were dark apparitions that scared me half to death. I was never harmed, but these were not peaceful experiences. Not at all.
Finding a rental in suburban Victoria that was actually affordable seemed like a miracle. My two housemates and I, all in our early 20s and juggling part-time jobs with the university, couldn't believe our luck when we found a charming house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was suspiciously cheap for the area, but we chalked it up to our good fortune, it being slightly run down, and a landlord eager to fill the place quickly. We moved in during the midst of an unusually warm summer. The house had a dated but cozy feel, with worn carpets and faintly creaking floorboards that we wrote off as part of its charm. It wasn't long before we started to notice some oddities. The first night while we were unpacking in the living room, we heard footsteps running up and down the hallway. We dismissed it as the house settling. Maybe it was the old pipes. But the footsteps continued every night, always around the same time, around 2 a.m. My room was the one at the end of the hallway, so I was often the last to hear the footsteps before they faded away. One night I decided to stay up to see if I could catch whatever or whoever was causing the noise. I sat in the living room, lights off, with only the glow from my laptop for company. Right on cue, the footsteps started. Light, rapid steps, unmistakably human yet not aligning with anyone's presence. As they approached the living room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew cold, and I heard them stop just short of the doorway where I was sitting. I looked up, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. We laughed it off the next day, but a sense of unease lingered. Then came the touches. It started with Claire, one of my housemates. She'd been studying at the kitchen table and suddenly felt a light brush against her shoulder, like someone lightly running their fingers just to get her attention. She'd whip around expecting to see one of us, but the room would be empty. Over time, Sam and I experienced the same cold, fleeting touches, ever so gentle but profoundly unsettling. The real terror, though, began with the sightings. One evening, while we were all relaxing in the living room, I noticed a shadowy figure peering in through the window. I jumped up, thinking someone was trying to break in, but as I moved closer, the figure seemed to melt away into the night. Sam saw it too, confirming I wasn't just seeing things. From that point on, the figure haunted us, watching from the windows, always just at the edge of our vision, disappearing whenever we tried to confront it. The worst night of our lives in that house started just like any other. We had gathered in the kitchen for a late dinner. Plates and cutlery clattered as we joked about the house being haunted, nervously laughing off our fear. It was around midnight when things took a turn. As we sat eating, the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath became visible, hanging in the air like smoke. The kitchen light flickered, casting erratic shadows all around us. Then, without warning, the pantry door flew open, and various canned goods and packages of dried food began to hurl themselves off the shelves. We stared in shock as they smashed against the walls and floor, clattering and some even opening from the force. Amid the chaos, A high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek filled the air, echoing throughout the house, like something from the depths of a nightmare. We bolted from the kitchen, only to find the hallway blocked by that same shadowy figure. It loomed larger than ever, a dark mass with indistinct features, but a very real presence. The air felt thick with hatred and malice radiating from us, so much so that it was almost tangible. We hesitated for a second that felt like an eternity, then bolted for the back door, leaving behind everything but our need to escape. We never spent another night in that house. We called the landlord the next morning, demanding an immediate termination of our lease. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, they didn't argue. We managed to find temporary accommodation with friends and eventually secured a new place, away from that cul-de-sac and any lingering spirits. Only later did we find out that that house had a history. Previous tenants had also left suddenly, some saying the place was haunted, others describing similar experiences to our own. It wasn't something the landlord ever mentioned, and perhaps it wasn't something they believed or wanted to believe. Living there changed us. We grew quieter, more introspective. I find myself glancing over my shoulder a lot more, half expecting to see a shadow peering back at me, even in the safety of my new home. Some nights, especially when it's quiet and the house is settling, I swear I can still hear those footsteps.
My encounter took place at a farmhouse in Lamington National Park, Queensland, Australia. The farmhouse is very old, around 100 years old, I think, and it was previously owned by the O'Reilly family, one of whom is famous for his rescue of the survivors of a crashed plane. The house is regularly rented out to holiday stayers, and I have stayed there on several occasions. On my last of these, several years ago, I swear I saw something, which I can only guess was a ghost. As anyone who has ever been in the country will know, it gets very dark at night. This, plus the layout of the house, made this a great place to play hide and seek in the dark. I was the seeker, and I decided to search in the main bedroom. There was a fire in the room opposite, so I could vaguely make out the contents of the room. However, as I entered, I suddenly stopped as, directly in front of me, a pitch-black shape appeared out of thin air. I cannot specifically describe the shape, as it didn't seem to have a distinct edge and it seemed to be constantly changing. It was, however, roughly my height and width. The thing itself, it was completely pitch black. Despite the fire behind me, I could make it out. I could also make out the contents of the room on either side of this thing. Almost as quickly as it appeared, a very dark red point of light, where I imagine its right eye would have been, appeared and began to glow brighter. At this point, I felt no fear, merely surprise and confusion at its sudden and unexpected appearance. I had never seen anything like this before. I did, however, decide that I no longer wanted to enter that room, and so I quickly walked backwards out of there. as I did so, the red eye began to fade again, and the entire thing vanished. After having explored the rest of the house and finding all but one of the hiders, I decided that it was time to search the main bedroom again. This time, no strange shape challenged me, and I quickly found that the last hider was on top of the wardrobe. Thinking that what I had seen might have possibly been him, I asked if he had been there the entire game, to which he said he had. It was also obvious that there could have been no way for him to have gotten up or down off that wardrobe without making enough noise for me to hear him from anywhere else in the house. It is only a small house, but it is very cluttered and very rickety. The floor creaks at every step. I don't know what it is I saw that night, and I honestly have no interest in finding out. I just wanted to share my experience with others. It was strange, and it makes a great campfire story.
When I was 10, my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. My father inherited an old house in remote New South Wales from a distant relative we barely knew. He thought it would be an idyllic place to raise a family, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did he know what awaited us. The house was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense bushland. It was the perfect picture of tranquility, at least during the day. The house itself had an eerie, antiquated charm, with creaking floorboards and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. My family consisted of my father, my mother, my older sister Lucy, and me. We moved in with excitement and a sense of adventure, unaware of the horrors that would unfold. The first few nights were uneventful. My father busied himself with repairs, my mother unpacked, and Lucy and I explored the property. On the fourth night, I had my first encounter. I was in my room, reading a book, when I felt a sudden chill. The room seemed darker than usual, and I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I looked up, and there, peering around the corner of the doorframe, was a figure. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but I could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure remained there for a few agonizing moments before disappearing. I convinced myself it was my imagination, despite the creeping fear that settled into my bones. Weeks passed, and odd things continued to happen, mostly to me. My toys would be moved around. My bed would occasionally shake in the middle of the night. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares or childish imagination. One night I woke up to a whispering voice, hissing my name. I sat up drenched in sweat, and saw the same figure from before, now at the foot of my bed. It was closer, clearer. It had no features, just an inky blackness. But as I stared at it, I noticed the whites of its eyes. I screamed, and my mother rushed in. The figure vanished the moment she opened the door, leaving her to comfort me and dismiss it as a bad dream. It wasn't until Lucy had her own experience that my parents began to take things seriously. She came to me one morning, pale and shaken, saying she'd seen a woman in old-fashioned clothes, standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with hollow eyes. My parents started to believe something was off, but didn't want to admit that something supernatural might be happening. Our situation escalated over the 5 years we lived there. It started small. Lights flickering, strange noises, cold drafts, but grew increasingly malicious. Here are two of the most chilling experiences that I remember vividly. The first event happened during our second year. My father had gone into town, leaving the rest of us alone. It was a stormy night, and the house seemed alive with its own energy. Lucy and I were in the living room, trying to watch TV despite the frequent flickers of power. Suddenly, the room went ice cold, and the TV turned off entirely. The next moment, the corner of the room darkened, and we both saw it. An unmistakable figure peering out from the shadows, its eyes catching the little light that remained. It slowly moved closer, and we could make out the shape of its mouth, twisted into a cruel smile. Lucy grabbed my hand, and we bolted upstairs to my parents' room, locking the door behind us. My mother tried to calm us down, but she too felt the coldness and unease that permeated the house. Another terrifying event occurred in our 4th year. My father had been more open to the idea that something was wrong. He brought in a local priest to bless the house after numerous pleas from my mother. That night, after the blessing, I was in the kitchen getting a drink of water when I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw the same figure that had haunted me for years, now clearer than ever. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with one side of his face hideously scarred. He stood at the entrance to the kitchen, blocking my exit. I was paralyzed with fear. He began to move towards me, slowly, deliberately, and every step he took he seemed to drain the warmth from the room. I fell to the floor, unable to move, only managing to scream when he was inches away. My father burst in, and the figure vanished, leaving the air thick with dread. The priest's blessing had stirred whatever malevolence resided there. In our final year, things became unbearable. The entire family started hearing voices, footsteps, and seeing the figure, now bolder and more frequent in its appearances. It seemed to thrive on our fear, growing stronger and more aggressive. Doors would slam, objects would fly across the room, and we all felt watched all the time. We decided enough was enough. One evening, as we packed our things to leave, the activity reached a fever pitch. The house shook, the temperature dropped to freezing, and all of us saw shadows darting around. It seemed the entity didn't want us to go, but we were resolute. We moved out the next day, leaving behind that cursed house and never looking back. We learned later the house had a dark history indeed. The man who built it, in the mid-1800s, was rumored to have gone mad and killed his family. His spirit, along with others, was said to haunt the property, reliving their final moments in a twisted loop of torment. We never spoke of it much after we left, but the memories linger. Even now, years later, sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, half expecting to see a face peering around the corner, watching and waiting. One night, my mate and I were camping by a secluded lake on my private property, deep in the Australian bush. Surrounded by towering gum trees, I lived about 35 to 40 minutes from the nearest town. It was a chilly evening in July, and the branches of the gum trees overhead were swaying ominously in the breeze. My friend, whom I'll call Jack, joined me for the night. As we relaxed at the campsite, enjoying a bit of weed in front of the campfire, I had an idea for a bit of fun. Since we were both really high, we decided to go for a wander through the bush. Bad part is, neither of us had brought a flashlight, so Jack and I ventured down a narrow path into the enveloping darkness of the bush. Jack was a few steps ahead of me when he suddenly froze. I started hearing strange, unsettling noises. As I turned to my left, Jack remained fixed, staring straight ahead. A faint sound, like a distant tinkling of a bell, but not exactly like that, filled the air. The noise grew louder and closer until it seemed to be right beside me. In a moment of fear, I let out a sharp gasp. Jack turned around, his expression filled with concern. "We should go back," he urged, his eyes wide with alarm. Back at the campsite, Jack finally revealed, "You want to know why I wanted to turn back?" Intrigued, I asked, "Why?" "I saw something. A huge, shadowy figure just behind one of the trees," he replied, his voice lowering to a whisper. Apparently, while I was preoccupied with eerie sounds, Jack had been transfixed by a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to lurk in the darkness for what felt like an eternity, until my gasp broke the spell.
When I was a young fella, my brother and I would often take camping trips out to the river. It was usually just myself and my bro, but I remember this one trip, my stepbrother and his girlfriend came along. I vaguely remember parts of this trip, but some stuff stands out. I'll go over the one notable occurrence. That's what you're here for, right? The creepy stuff. Well, yeah, it definitely was that. We had been out that way many times, and despite it being quite an eerie-looking spot, it was never scary. I didn't think so anyway. The first time I remember being truly scared out there, it was myself, my brother, and my stepbrother. We were walking and talking, and my stepbrother starts trying to scare us, telling us stories of things that supposedly lurked out there in the bush. I remember distinctly, this was the first time I ever heard about the Quinkins. He kept telling us random stories about people who had seen them. This would be my very first introduction to Aboriginal spirits and beasts. It wasn't at that point I got truly scared though. I was more fascinated than anything. I had always been into dark and scary things, so these stories, they simply captivated my imagination rather than freaked me out. It was when we rounded a bend and came into a large clearing, one that housed a very sizable waterhole, that the scary stuff began. I remember my stepbrother. He just stopped on the spot and, in an instant, turned and bolted off down the road. That gave me and my brother a fright. It wasn't entirely out of the ordinary though. This bloke was a weirdo, and he'd often do random shit like this. But then we saw what caused him to run. Picture this scene, right? This waterhole. It's pretty bloody big, and on the far side of it, there's this massive rock wall. During the daylight hours, it's a popular activity for people to climb up the side and jump off into the water. At night though, it's always deserted. Not tonight though. We see it, and at first, it's just barely discernible shadows. Then we start to make out forms. My brother's the first to say it. "Is that people up there?" And we both just stare up. I saw it too. Yep, for sure. Human-shaped figures walking up the rocks, off to the side. There's about 5 or 6 of them, dragging their bodies up the scrub. Not walking. I mean, quite literally, dragging themselves up. Their arms and legs flailing outwards as they do so. As they get to the top, they all kinda line up side by side, still laying on their guts. Now, their heads and the tops of their torsos hanging over the edge of the rock wall. That's bloody dangerous. Yeah, people jump from there, but there's a certain spot you gotta jump from to clear any rocks beneath. These guys, they're aiming their heads right towards those rocks, and they're teetering right on the edge. At this point, we yelled out, "Hey, what are yous doing? Get down from there, you dickheads. You're gonna get hurt." But they didn't listen. Instead, in unison, they simply leaned further and further over the rock wall edge before plummeting downwards. We watched in horror as these people bounced off the rocks on the way down before splattering into the waters at the bottom, much of which made for shallow cover over sharp rocks just beneath the surface. There's no way in hell anyone's surviving that. We stood there in a state of shock at what we had just witnessed. We had just watched people die right in front of us. That horror lasted barely a second before it was replaced by another. For when we glanced back up to see if we could catch a glimpse of where they ended up, we surely did, but not as we expected. Cold fear gripped us in an instant as we watched these things bobbing up and down in the water, floating ever so slowly towards us, their heads straight up and ahead, their faces pointed at us. It was very clear now that we were not looking at human beings. These things were shadowy, dark, humanoid, but far from human. Their faces were the dead giveaway. You could barely make out these once human features, but the eyes were hollow, as were the mouths that gaped wide open as they floated through the water, coming ever closer to us. It is a strange sensation, being literally frozen in fear. Unless you've experienced it, you can't possibly understand it. But in that moment, all we could do was stand there in the night, nothing but the splish-splash of the water as these things bobbed up and down, ominously surfing their way towards us. It was only when they reached the banks of the waterhole and began dragging their disgusting forms up out of the water, and we got a close-up look at their gaping mouths and lanky, shadowy limbs, that we turned and ran, just as my stepbrother had before. It was obvious that these things were chasing us. As we clambered up the sands, making a beeline for the cover of the bush, we would steal glances back to see them practically floating after us. The strange thing was, once we hit the bush, they just kind of stopped. They were floating, dancing around on the sands. Not that we hung around to make sure that's all they were doing. We absolutely booked it back to camp, packed up our shit and told our stepbrother that we were leaving. That was my first and last time to see what I believe was a Quinkin. I mean, I have no idea what else it could have been. The description seems spot on. I suppose it could have been something else. Another spirit of the land that I'm unaware of. But from the stories I've heard, that's what it was. Let me tell you, they scared me more than any other ghost I've ever heard tales of. The sheer oddity of what they were doing, yet how deliberate they were in their actions. The way they just slowly floated across that water. The way they toppled off the rock wall. None of it made any sense, and yet we were very clearly their target. I still don't know why they were coming for us that night, what their intentions were. I hate the thought of those wide, gaping mouths every time they appear in my nightmares. Yep, I still have those. People often talk of ghostly encounters with some sense of wonder, of fascination. But let me tell you, it's not. It's traumatic. It's terrifying. And I hope I never see these things again.
I'm an Australian scout, and about 2 years ago, I was a cub when this happened. The order goes Joeys, Cubs, Scouts, and Ventures if that helps. I went to this big cub camp, roughly 1,000 plus scouts. It's called Kubari. Not sure if I spelt it right. It's when cubs from all around Australia come together and do activities and do scout things. I don't know. Anyways, my group was called Cassowaries, with a bunch of boys and 7-ish girls. Me, my sister, and the other girls shared a tent. We stayed there for a week, but on the 5th night I woke up at around 3 to 5 a.m. by my sister. She looked terrified. She told me to look at the end of my sleeping bag. And when I looked there was blood. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and saw that there was a hole at the end of it. I looked at my foot, and there was a stab wound just under my toes. Me and my sister sat there staring at my foot until I noticed a light through the side of my tent. It looked as if a knife had cut through the tent and stabbed me. Me and my sister walked out of the tent with a flashlight. Our tent was right next to the fence. As we walked around the tent, I saw a pure white figure staring at me from behind the fence. My sister told me not too long ago that she saw the same thing. We woke the other girls and started to walk to the toilets. They were about 15 minutes from our tent. We told the other girls what we saw. My sister didn't say that she also saw the figure. One of the girls believed us. The others didn't. I showed them my foot and the hole in the tent, and they still didn't believe me. Ever since then, I've been having the same figure following me. Not in the open or in big crowds. They show up in my dreams. I've seen them quite a lot. I don't know how to communicate with them or if I want to. They act sorta as if they're my guardian, or they're trying to protect me. And it feels like they only show themselves when I'm doing something stupid or if I'm having bad anxiety. If you have any advice about what I should do, that'd be awesome. Thank you. G'day all. 40-something-year-old bloke with a story that I think would fit nicely here. Me and my mates go fishing and camping often, around the rivers in rural New South Wales. It was summertime, 2003 when this happened. We were all packed up and headed out for an alcohol-fueled weekend around Guinea, along the Manning River. It was a nice spot for fishing and some beautiful camping spots around those parts. So we're sitting around the fire that night, and as usual, we're all trying to spook each other, as you do out there late at night. Hey, boys just don't grow up, okay? We're chucking around ghost stories and tales of creepy crawlies, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, me mates stop talking and just stare right over my shoulder. I think they're messing with me, so I just say whatever. But they just keep looking straight ahead, right into the bush. Well, starting to get a bit spooked now. I turn around in my chair, real quiet. At first I didn't see anything. Nothing but shade of absolute black out there in the scrub. Then, one of the shades of black took 2 giant steps toward the camp. Holy shitballs, we were not sticking around for that. All of us piled into the car and locked the doors, just in time to see this thing take another step. We could see it clear by the light of the campfire now. It was at least 8 foot tall. My first thought was the stories of yowies I'd heard growing up, but this didn't look like what I'd hear about them. It stood with bent knees, walking around sniffing the air. The arms were hairy, and the head looked like some kind of warped animal. That's what got me thinking, skinwalker. I know there's a Navajo origin, but it's the closest thing I could draw a comparison to. This giant, bloody dog, bear, human thing turned and faced our car. And it just stood there, watching us, pacing back and forth. I don't know if it could see us. The car was parked back where it was a lot darker. So maybe not. But just in case, we squished ourselves down as far as we could go, until we couldn't really see it anymore, and hopefully it hadn't seen us. All night we stayed huddled like that, listening to this thing pace around, sometimes circling the car. We were too scared to open our eyes. Maybe it was looking in, right at us. I'll never know. All I know is that finally it left after what felt like hours, and I was glad to never see it again. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. Yowie? Australian skinwalker? Something else entirely? I'll never know. And you know what? I never want to.
Have you ever visited Australia? I'm guessing most of you who have said yes have probably seen the sights of Sydney, Melbourne, maybe Brizzy and the Gold Coast. If you've never been to the north, you've missed out. Picture sprawling, white sand beaches, lush rainforests and rolling green hinterlands. At the heartland of all this, North Queensland's tropical urban playground, Cairns. That's where I based myself during my last trip to Oz. There's more than enough to do in and around Cairns that you can easily kill 2 or 3 weeks. And that I did. I snorkeled, I dived, I fished, I hiked, and I swam to my heart's content. The whole trip was set to culminate with a 3-night hike and camp excursion into one of the region's most extensive rainforests, the Daintree. A group of 5 of us, including the tour guide, would take part. They like to keep the groups for these tours small so as to minimize their impact on the natural environment. We set off on a Sunday morning, fog enveloping the road as we headed off toward our point of entry. My senses went into overload as soon as I stepped out of the van and took in the smells and the sights of the rainforest. It was nothing short of breathtaking. Hours and hours we trekked, our guide ensuring we followed a path of relative safety along the way. I say relative because, well, that's what it was. We all signed waivers before embarking on this tour, and we were all aware of the risks. There are a great many things within the Aussie rainforests quite capable of killing you. Not least of all, the mighty cassowary birds and if you get close enough to the Daintree River, you might just find yourself an easy meal for a crocodile. I was confident, however, that our guide would get us through safely. I wasn't going to waste my time worrying about things that could go wrong when I was surrounded by some of the most beautiful natural scenery on the entire face of this planet Earth. Day 1 came to an end and it was time to set up camp. We did so in a small natural clearing. This was part of the appeal of this tour. Nothing we were going to see, sleep on, nor walk on was man-made. Well, aside from our swags, of course. We settled in for the night, and I fell into a blissful sleep, drifting off to the ambient sounds of the night. We all awoke the next morning to birdsong, a light patter of rain, and the morning sun shining tiny little rays of light down beneath the thick canopy. Even at full pelt, it struggled to break through. So, a lot of the time we were left relying on our flashlights. It must have been a couple of hours into the next day's hike when we noticed a member of our group was missing. Instantly, our guide went into protocol mode, backtracking the path that we had come from. He was, of course, reassuring everyone, keeping us calm. But I could see it in his eyes. The fear was setting in. This wasn't right. A member of our group had disappeared within a matter of seconds, without anyone noticing. We were rightfully scared. But it was when we spun around to find a second member of our group gone that the panic really set in. Myself and the remaining member of our group resolved to keep each other in eyeshot at all times. The tour guide wasn't taking any more chances, grabbing me by the arm and exclaiming, "We're leaving, now." Didn't need to tell me twice. We began the long trek back out of the rainforest. Strangely, our guide continuously urged us to walk with haste, but not to run. I found this odd, of course, as if there was something out here picking people off. Wouldn't we want to get the hell out of here as fast as possible? Occasionally, our pace would quicken into a jog, and our guide would hiss at us, "Slow down, don't move too quickly." And so we obeyed, walking as quickly as we could, while making the least amount of noise possible. As we walked, I began to notice things, shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. Imperceptible at first, but more and more noticeable the longer we walked. They began as flashes, something I could pass off as nothing. And at first, I was resolved to not look anywhere but straight ahead. It was not until one of these shadows caught my eye, and then failed to leave the edges of my vision, that I took a peek. Not normal. What I was looking at was entirely wrong. It was something resembling the human form, but hunched, thicker than it should be. A look of complete and total emptiness on its face, as its beady, black eyes stared back at me. A feeling of something ancient, something primitive, something altogether wrong. The others had noticed it too, it seems, as all three of us were now locked in the trance I had found myself in. Our breaths short, quickening. And as we gazed, it began to step forward. One step, then another, then another. The crunch of a dry leaf beneath its awful form was enough to snap us out of our stupor, as our guide breathed a quick series of words, which we followed without question. On my mark, follow me. Do not look back. Run. And so we did. We ran. We ran faster than I ever thought possible. All the while, I could hear something behind us. Something inhuman. Something moving much faster than it looked like it should have been able to. I began to feel my breathing intensify, my lungs burning, my legs inevitably turning to jelly. Adrenaline was pushing our bodies far past the point of physical exhaustion, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before instinct could fuel us no further. For one of us, this would sadly not be an issue, as I saw a black flash roar past me and drag my one remaining tour companion into the forest. I heard the most god-awful scream I have ever heard, and as I continued to run, to my horror, I heard the unmistakable sound of a man being eaten alive. Those sounds will haunt me until the day I take my final step into death's embrace myself. We did not stop. We continued running until the canopy began to open up, until the sun began to beat down upon us, until finally we emerged from that damned rainforest, from that nightmare. The two of us practically threw ourselves into the van, and we floored it off down the tiny access road. I lay in the back, exhausted, traumatized, and absolutely devastated. I had just witnessed something not of this earth, something vile, something evil. I would never forget the look of that thing as it took those slow steps toward us. That look on its face, that look of utter indifference towards us. It had no sympathy for us. All it knew is that it was hungry. I've never experienced a feeling like that before. A feeling of a complete and total lack of empathy being felt towards you. It is the most helpless I have ever felt in my life, and I hope I never experience that again. That drive out of the rainforest, down that lonely access road, was absolutely harrowing. For as I gazed out of the side of the window of the van, I saw something that made me realize just how lucky I was to still be among the land of the living. I saw the unmistakable sight of dozens, no, maybe hundreds of pairs of beady eyes staring out from within the trees.
Let's get one thing straight. I've hiked the Blue Mountains before, but nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced during what was supposed to be a routine trek through its canyons. It began as a clear morning, the kind Aussies brag about. The eucalypt haze that gave the Blue Mountains their name wrapped around the cliffs in a dreamy shroud. I set off from Katoomba, pumped for a day of solitude and the haunting beauty of the Gross Valley. Honestly, I should have turned back when, I first felt that tingle on my neck, the one you get when you think someone's watching you. But being the dauntless bloke I pretend to be, I chalked it up to the chill of the mountain air. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, mind set on the shifting shadows between the gum trees, and that's when I got lost. The paths here wind around and double back like a snake. I've trekked them plenty, but today they had teeth, and they bit me, hard. Hours passed, and I realized I was properly stuffed. Night fell like a curtain, fast, unforgiving. I've never known dark like that, not the city kind. This was a velvety, pressing darkness that oozes into your bones and stays there. My phone's flashlight cut through it like a weak whisper against the thunderstorm. Every tree looked like a gnarled hand, and every bush rustle felt like a warning. Here's the goosebump bit. I wasn't alone. Not once did I see it clearly, but by the twitch of twilight, there was something behind me. A presence that hummed with malice. You know those stories of Aussie spirits? The ones old-timers talk about in hushed tones by the fire? I'd laugh them off, but out here, laughter was about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. It felt like a hunt, and I was the quarry, stumbling over roots, my breath a ragged prayer. My phone beeped a low battery warning. Seriously, now? I pushed through the bush, gripping the phone like a talisman. But even text cold comfort was slipping away. The hours to dawn stretched eternal. My world shrunk to the feeble circle of my dying light. When the brush gave way to an open dirt road, it felt like a mirage. I was giddy with relief, like this was some twisted, outback Wizard of Oz junk. There wasn't a yellow brick road, but I'd have kissed the dirt if I hadn't been so parched. I followed it, boots crunching. When the ranger station silhouetted against the night, I could have wept. The ranger was a bloke named Darryl. Look of a man who's seen it all, and then some. He listened to my tale with a grave nod and gave me a lift back to my ute, throwing glances to the rear view, like he expected my ghostly mate to be thumbing a rind. "Don't hike alone," he said, his voice almost lost in the engine's growl. "Especially not when the mountain's restless." I haven't been back since. People say it was all in my head. Dehydration, panic, the bush playing tricks. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, when the city's asleep and my flat's quiet, I swear I hear that whisper of a presence. I feel that shiver down my spine. Sydney's got enough to explore without looking for trouble. You ever find yourself up in the Blue Mountains? Stick to the beaten path, and for the love of all that's holy, respect the signs, both the ones in the ground and the ones in the gut, and bring a bloody good torch. We had just moved into a new house on the border of Victoria, Australia. My dad always wanted to live on a farm, so we bought a small, run-down house with a big piece of land. When my family and I first went to check out the house, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I didn't say anything about it, and just kept my feelings to myself. Finally, the day came, and we moved in. My bedroom was on the top floor, and it had a tiny window. After unpacking all day, I was so tired that I fell asleep on my mattress. During the night, I was jolted awake by the slamming of doors, footsteps echoing in the hallway, and a sudden chill in the air. Was it a ghost? Dad always said there were no such things as monsters or ghosts. Maybe he was wrong. After that night, nothing spooky happened for a week. On Saturday night, Mum and Dad went out for dinner by themselves, so I was left alone in the house. I would have called a friend, but I had just moved, so I didn't know anyone yet. so I decided to watch some TV. While watching, I heard a strange noise coming from the driveway. Our driveway is really long, so I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. The sound was almost like a girl crying or being hurt, but I wasn't sure. I walked down the driveway to see what was going on. Suddenly, I felt a presence beside me. I looked down, but no one was there. Even though it scared me, I tried not to let it bother me too much. To this day, there are still footsteps echoing in the hallway. Doors creak open by themselves. And sometimes, I feel an unexplained cold spot in certain rooms.
Over the last few months, strange things have been happening here. The first sign of something out of the ordinary was when I woke up one morning to find my bedroom door locked from the outside, with the inside being unlocked. When I go to bed, it's the other way around, as logically, I can't lock the door on the outside while I'm standing inside. I got home from work one night the next week to discover this time that the door was locked inside and unlocked outside, completely opposite of how I'd left it. And now this. As I type this, my dog is going berserk, barking, scratching and sniffing at my bedroom door, where 2 hours ago, an unseen something slammed the door hard against my hand as I reached in to turn the light off. I've only been living in this house for a bit under 2 years, and my current room is just over 2 months. My sister lived in there the whole time before I moved my stuff in, and she says she never experienced anything unusual. Am I being targeted?
My mates and I had always been curious about the old abandoned mine at the edge of our town, hidden deep within the bushland of Western Australia. Legend said it was haunted by the ghosts of miners who met unfortunate ends. Despite the warnings from our parents, we decided to sneak in and explore it one night. The air was thick with the scent of moist earth and decaying leaves as we trudged through the bush. With only our flashlights to guide us, we reached the entrance of the mine. It was a gaping, dark hole that seemed to swallow the light. Despite a feeling of apprehension, we stepped inside. The inside of the mine was eerily silent, except for the sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. As we delved deeper, the air grew colder, and there was a palpable sense of dread. Just as we were about to turn back, we noticed faint, ghostly lights moving in the distance. They floated around, then disappeared into the darkness. Undeterred, we decided to follow them. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. We heard whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, telling tales of the miners' tragic past. Broken tools and old mining carts littered the pathways, like artifacts from another time. At one point, my flashlight suddenly flickered and went out. In the pitch black, I felt something brush past me. My friend screamed as his flashlight revealed a fleeting shadow with hollow eyes, staring back at us. It vanished just as quickly as it appeared. Panicking, we tried to retrace our steps, but the mine seemed to change its layout. Tunnels that led us in were replaced by new, unfamiliar passages. Fear tightened its grip on us, and we ran in an attempt to escape. Eventually we stumbled upon a makeshift altar with old helmets and other mining gear arranged on it. The atmosphere was suffocating with the sense of despair and longing. Just as we thought we were lost forever, a faint light appeared, guiding us back to the entrance. We didn't question our luck. We just bolted out of the mine and didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our homes. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the faint whispers and see the ghostly lights whenever I closed my eyes. It's been 20 years now, and none of us have ever spoken of that night again. But we all knew one thing was for sure. The ghosts of the abandoned mine were real, and they didn't like to be disturbed.
This story is very recent, and I'm curious as to why it happened. I was trying to get to sleep one night, but I wasn't very tired. I was laying in my room, which has another spare room next to it. The door of the spare room was open, and I was staring at my large bear collection, trying to sleep. All of a sudden, my bears started talking to me, which of course is very odd. I thought I was going crazy. It took me a moment to really listen to what they were saying. They were urgently telling me, "Don't let Elka get you." I got very scared and wondered if I was imagining it, wondering how I was imagining it. I didn't know anyone called Elka, and I still don't. I was about to yell for my mum when the voices stopped and a tall, dark shadow came out of the spare bedroom, wandering into my room. I completely froze. I have a very, very great fear of ghosts, having seen them on multiple occasions. But this one was clearly not nice like the ones I'd seen before. I could feel it. It suddenly got very cold, and I wanted to pull up my doona, but I was too scared to move. The shadow that was standing in my doorway suddenly began lumbering towards me. It came closer and sat on the end of my bed, and I felt the bed move, like someone really was sitting on it. It sat there for about a minute, lurching over the bed, and then left. Every night from then on, I have kept that spare room door shut. Does anyone know why this would have happened? It was very strange, very different to the spirits I've normally seen.
My family and I were on a road trip through the Nullarbor Plain, a vast arid expanse stretching across Western and South Australia. One evening we decided to set up camp near a desolate area known to locals as the Eucla Telegraph Station ruins. The site intrigued us, and we figured it would be an interesting spot to camp for the night. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the sandy terrain, we pitched our tents and started a campfire. The stillness of the Nullarbor was both peaceful and eerie. My little sister asked Dad to tell us a ghost story, and he obliged with an old tale about the spirits of explorers who once traveled these remote lands. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I stepped out of my tent to get some fresh air and was greeted by an unsettling sight. In the distance, a figure stood, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and seemed to be draped in ragged clothing, staring directly at our camp. My heart raced as I considered waking my parents, but something in me felt compelled to approach the figure. As I drew nearer, the figure turned and started to walk away, almost gliding over the sand. Curious and unnerved, I followed, keeping a safe distance. The figure led me to the ruins of the old Uclueler telegraph station, now partially buried in sand. Suddenly, the air around me grew cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure stopped in front of one of the crumbling walls, turned to face me, and then vanished into thin air. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a whispering sound, like a breeze blowing through the ruins. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, turning into unintelligible, frenetic murmurs that surrounded me. Shadows danced on the walls, and I felt an icy hand brush against my cheek. Panic set in, and I sprinted back to the camp as fast as I could. When I reached the tents, I was out of breath, heart pounding, and covered in cold sweat. I didn't wake anyone. I just crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream. The next morning I checked the area around the ruins, but there were no signs of the figure or anything unusual. I never spoke of that night again, but I could never shake the feeling that something from another time lingered in the ruins of the Uclueler telegraph station. Something that wanted to remind the living of its haunting presence.
I have been having experiences with the paranormal since I was about 12 or 13. I'm 21 now. As a teenager, a few friends and I used to conduct seances and do things to scare ourselves. Many things happened to us in these times, and we eventually understood that we didn't know what we were doing. So we stopped playing around with things that we didn't understand. When I was about 16, we moved into a very old house where my uncle used to live. I still remember those 3 or 4 days after we had moved in. I was home alone, and I could hear a PowerPoint flicking in the next room next door. I knew it was a spirit, but I didn't feel threatened by it. But as the years passed, I noticed there was more than one spirit. One minute, I would feel completely relaxed. The next minute, I would get the creeps. This is how I came to the conclusion that there was more than one of these things lurking around. Many friends that have come to my house have commented on feeling like they were being watched. One actually said that they felt it was an old man, which is funny because I felt that too. I don't live inside the actual house, but in a bungalow out in the backyard. 2 or 3 years ago, I started to notice a presence creeping into my room, like I was constantly being watched from one particular spot. And there would also be these cracking noises. I did feel like I wasn't wanted out there, and it did give me the creeps. About 18 months ago, I had this bizarre experience where I thought I was dreaming. A lady with an angry look on her face walked fast towards me and slapped me. I woke up, holding my face. I've always wondered whether I was in this semi-sleep state, and did this actually happen for real? Things have been going missing. My TV remote has never been found, even after I turned my room upside down looking for it. Water droplets have fallen on me from nowhere. A few years ago, I had real problems with sleepwalking. In the last year, things have been getting crazy. I get the feeling this spirit doesn't want me sleeping, because whenever I get into that stage where I'm about to drift into a deep sleep, I hear this loud thud or a crack or something falling over. I've also been waking up with bruises on my knuckles. I've been at breaking point in the last 2 weeks. It seems this thing has become very angry with me. I don't know why. I've been hearing footsteps circling my bed, strings being plucked on my guitar, the window blinds moving, and loud thuds against the wall. It has scared me so much that I've begun sleeping inside the house. And then I got worried that I had given it the upper hand, given it confidence. So the next night, I went back out and everything was fine. But the very next night, things started up again. As soon as I heard it was back, I sat up in my bed and said out loud, "Do you want to start, do ya?" The second I said that, a poster ripped off the wall and stuff flew out from under my bed. I slept inside again that night. 2 nights ago, I decided to smudge. The night I smudged, I removed surfboards and stuff from the corner. Then I felt like I was being watched, where the spirit stood. Everything was fine that night. Last night, after smudging, I was paid a visit yet again. It was early in the night. Only around 8:30 p.m. I went to bed. There was tapping on the windows, footsteps, like someone running, and it sounded like something was being thrown from wall to wall. Again, I went and slept inside. Things do happen inside. They just don't scare me as much, and I don't feel as if they're after me. Well, I did think that. Last night, when I was sleeping on my mum's bed, I woke up to the feeling that something was hovering above my face. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I also woke up twice being shaken. I've also experienced this in my room. I don't know what to do. I've asked them to leave. I've smudged, and I've laid out salt around my windows. What else? I feel like I'm helpless, and no one else can help me either. The thing that scares me as well is that I'm moving house in a few weeks. I'm scared that whatever this is going to follow me, and I will be living alone.
It was a Friday night. My cousin and her brother were staying over at our house in Bathurst, New South Wales. My cousin was about 15 years old. We lived in a 2-story home, so my parents and her brother were downstairs in the den. My younger sister and I were in the living room, and my older cousin was in a spare bedroom getting ready to sleep. I was curled up on the couch, watching TV, when suddenly, a loud scream split the air. I jumped up and ran to the spare room to see what happened. My cousin was sitting upright, her face pale. She said the bed had been shaking while she was on it. Thinking it was a joke, I told her to stop messing around and went back to the couch. 15 minutes later, another scream came, even louder and more frantic than before. I rushed back to the spare room yelling, "What's wrong now?" with wide eyes. She said the bed was shaking again. I was just about to walk away when the bed started moving crazily right in front of us. It shook back and forth like someone or something was gripping it. My cousin burst into tears and jumped off the bed, and the shaking stopped instantly. I checked under the bed, sure that her brother was pranking us, but there was nothing there. Was it a poltergeist? To this day, I don't know if we imagined it or if it was something real. Neither my cousin nor I have talked about it since, but a week later, another strange thing happened. It was a quiet Wednesday evening. I was alone in the house, reading a book. My family had gone out for dinner and I just wanted some quiet time. I was deep into a suspenseful chapter when I heard faint whispers from the hallway. I thought it was just the house settling or the wind outside, and brushed it off. But the whispers got louder and seemed to come closer. My heart pounded as I put my book down and listened harder. It wasn't my imagination. There were real, murmuring voices in the hallway. Summoning all my courage, I walked towards the sound. The whispers stopped the moment I stepped into the hallway. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran through me. Nothing further happened that night, though. Over the next few days, weird things happened more often. Lights flickered for no reason, doors creaked open by themselves, and some rooms had cold spots. We tried to tell ourselves it was faulty wiring or drafts, but it happened so much that it became hard to ignore. One night, while brushing my teeth, I saw a shadowy figure in the bathroom mirror behind me. My blood ran cold and I quickly turned around, but the room was empty. I splashed water on my face, hoping I was just tired, but the image of that shadow stuck with me. My younger sister and I were too frightened to sleep alone, so we started sharing a room. Our nights were filled with uneasy sleep and whispers of, "Did you hear that?" during the dark, quiet hours. We didn't tell our parents, afraid they wouldn't believe us or would think we were just causing trouble. One night, the strange activities reached a peak. My family and I were in the living room trying to watch a movie. Halfway through, the lights flickered and the room became freezing. We huddled together, our breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, the TV turned to static and whispers filled the room. The whispers got louder, almost deafening, and objects started moving by themselves. Books flew off shelves, picture frames broke, and an old clock chimed wildly. Panicking, we ran to the den for safety. The creepy activity followed us as if something unseen wanted us gone. In the chaos, we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed our things and left the house that night, staying at a family friend's place. Leaving was hard, but necessary for our peace of mind. Weeks later, when we came back to get our belongings, the house felt different. The creepy presence seemed to have gone, leaving an eerie silence. We moved out soon after, leaving behind what was once our home, but had turned into a place of unexplained terror.